Consultant Psychologist with PPS. I am essentially going to be presenting a video every Tuesday morning at 9:15 on topics related to mental health in the workplace, and especially as we are navigating COVID-19 challenges. So I've presented a number of videos already. Feel free to jump onto our page and check those out. They're also on YouTube, so easy to view. But today's topic that I will be covering is managing conflict in the workplace. And there are a number of sort of tips and tricks that I have for this week. I've got 5 altogether, which I will summarize at the end, but hopefully will give everybody a few solutions as to how to navigate these types of challenges, and especially in the current climate where things are a little bit more stressful than they would otherwise be. Good morning, Jess, good to see you. So yeah, when we are feeling stressed, when stress levels are running high, the more likely we are to actually feel overwhelmed, and the more quick we are to react to things. So this can obviously lead to conflict in the workplace as well as outside of the workplace, and can be challenging as co-workers are sort of navigating their way around one another in stressful circumstances. So I wanted to also say that this is particularly difficult when we can't rely on our normal ways of communicating. So for example, at the moment, a lot of us are still working from home and relying on technology, so things can be misinterpreted a little bit more. Anyway, I'm going to jump straight in so that I can give as much detail as possible in this next 15 to 20 minutes. But the 5 tips for today are, first of all, recognizing that perceptions may be different to reality. Second of all, being mindful of your styles of communication and aiming for assertiveness. Thirdly, listening. It's something that we always talk about, but it's harder to do. Fourthly, recognizing your own and your colleagues' successes along the way. And finally, correcting and apologizing if you were in the wrong. So I'm going to go through each of those and sort of provide some examples with each, so hopefully they are relatable, and I'll summarize again at the end. If anybody who's watching this has any questions, please feel free to pop them in the comments section or send us a private message. I'm more than happy to get back to you that way. So firstly, recognizing that perceptions may be different to reality. I think this is a really important one, not only in the workplace, but also in life in general. So when we're feeling negative emotions, and in this particular example, it might be because we're stressed trying to adapt to current challenges, we're more likely to have negative thoughts and assume that these thoughts are facts, despite the evidence of the situation. So this is something that's called emotional reasoning. It's what we call an unhelpful thinking style, and it can really affect how we behave as well. So I'm going to give an example of this. Let's imagine you're in a meeting and you're ready to present on something, and a colleague says, let's try and keep this to 20 minutes. If you're already feeling anxious and stressed going into the meeting, you might jump to the conclusion that your colleague was thinking that your work wasn't worth their time, and this may change the way that you actually communicate with them. So for example, you might avoid eye contact, you might not present your best work, or you might be underconfident because you're concerned about the quality of your work. This is an example of sort of passivity, which I will outline a bit more below. You might also feel angry because you've spent so long on your contribution, and you might comment that your colleague should just take as much time as needed and sort of react on impulse there. And of course, then your colleague may well react to that. And already there are sort of the early makings of conflict there. So the question is, what can you do about this? First of all, I would suggest asking yourself, do I actually have any evidence that this thought is true? So in other words, that my colleague is thinking that my work isn't worth their time. And secondly, is there any evidence that I'm discounting? So for example, it might be that your colleague also has a lot on their plate, and they're trying to be quite conscious of everyone's schedules so that they can be as productive with their day and with everyone else's days as possible. So just asking yourself, are there different ways to look at this? Another example might be if a friend of yours or another colleague was in this situation and they were describing the evidence, what would your perception be of that? So this can help to kind of shed some more light on the situation and help you to not jump to conclusions as much, which may then change your behaviour and therefore result in conflict being less likely. Number 2, I said be mindful of styles of communication and aim for assertiveness. So I'm going to give some examples of the different ways in which we can communicate and what purposes they serve. So first of all, I'll give an example for a situation in which this might play out. So imagining you and your colleague are needing to work later on a project together, so after business hours. A passive communicator might say something like, "Don't worry about it, I'll get it done, you go home." What this does, when you communicate in a passive way, it serves the other person's needs, but it doesn't serve your own. So your colleague might be quite happy in this instance because they get to go home, but you'll be disgruntled, which may eventually build up. If it keeps happening, it might build up and boil over at some point, which may lead to conflict. So being passive isn't always helpful. The next style is aggressiveness, and this serves your needs but not the other person's. So an example of this might be something like, "You've barely done anything so far, I don't care what else is on your plate, just do it." In this example, you may feel relieved in the short term, but your colleague may be upset, which could also lead to conflict in the workplace. So just be mindful of that one. Next is passive aggressive, and this term gets thrown around a lot at the moment, but I think it's important to emphasize that passive aggression serves neither your needs or the other person, so it's really unhelpful. An example of this might be, "No, it's fine, I'll just work all night then." And essentially what this is doing is it's displaying aggression but in more of a passive way. So it's aggression disguised as passivity. Nothing is achieved, like I said, for either of you, and you'll both end up frustrated and be more likely to say something you don't mean, which again can be the start of conflict. So passive aggression, not a helpful way to communicate. I'll come back to making mistakes a little bit later in my talk, but the final way of communicating, which tends to be the best outcome for everybody, is assertiveness. So this is serving your needs as well as the needs of the other person, which means that both of you are going to feel as if your needs are met in the work climate. So an example of assertiveness might be, "I recognize that we need to get this project done, but I also need to prioritize my family tonight. How about we call it at 8 p.m? So this lets your colleague know what's going on for you and also allows you to be there for them. So there's no ambiguity with this. You're being really upfront, you're recognizing your needs as well as their needs, and it's less likely to lead to conflict. I want to make a note as well here for online communications. It's probably better to, if you're going to be having these discussions, to actually have them over the phone or on a video chat so that somebody can actually hear your tone of voice. In this way, it's less likely to be misinterpreted. So that's assertive communication. Strategy number 3 is listening. And again, this is, it's something that's spoken about a lot, but when we are feeling really anxious or angry or stressed, our brains are just simply not in a position to listen intently or to problem solve. And I've spoken about the sort of neuropsychology of this a little bit in my previous talks, but listening, as we know, when we feel listened to, we feel heard, we feel understood, and the same is going to be true for your colleagues. So it's key, it's absolutely key in validating the other person's concerns. Even if you disagree, you can disagree and still hear them out. As I said before, if you are completely overwhelmed, you're less likely to be able to listen in the moment because your emotions are running high. So in this case, ask for a break to calm your body down. So do some breathing, go for a walk, just create a bit of a stopgap there, and then come back to the conversation. It's much better to do this than, for example, to react on impulse and say something you don't mean, which again could lead to conflict. So take a break if you need to. And again, I want to make a note that if you're working from home, this might involve actually taking some time out of your diary to schedule an extra meeting with a colleague so that you can hear their concerns. So you might need to be a little bit proactive about it. But again, this will allow for them to be heard just in the same way that you would like to be. Now, next is recognizing your own and your colleagues' successes. And this is something that can fall by the wayside really easily, especially, for example, when you're a business owner and you're focused on making ends meet. So we've spoken with a lot of our colleagues and business owners, clients at the moment. They're sort of scrambling to adapt to the current circumstances with COVID and make sure that everything's sort of functioning as best it can be. But what we know is that conflict can arise from people feeling under-recognized in the workplace. And this goes for you as well as your colleagues. So if we're focusing only on what we haven't done or what our colleague hasn't done rather than what we or they have, over time, this can negatively impact how we feel or how they feel. And that potentially can also lead to conflict. So the solution to this is really regularly reflecting on your own successes, even if it's taking a few minutes each day to say, okay, what have we achieved today? What have we made progress with? And ensuring that you bring your colleagues or your employees' successes to light. That is going to help everybody to be able to recognize what progress has been made rather than just what the struggles have been. So, finally, correcting and apologizing if you are in the wrong. So, we are all human beings, none of us are perfect, and we are all going to stuff up every now and then. So, if you have said the wrong thing to a colleague, and as per the example that I gave before, it could be because you've misinterpreted something that they've said because you were feeling distressed. You can make amends, and I think this is so important to emphasize. In psychology, we always talk about the relationship between anxiety or stress and avoidance. And what we know is that people often avoid when they're feeling overly stressed and anxious. Because it just all feels too overwhelming. And again, your brain is not in a position to be able to problem solve. But of course, this doesn't fix the issue, and particularly if it's an interpersonal issue in the workplace, avoiding it is not going to help. In fact, it's just going to make it fester over time and sort of result in communication difficulties. And it could, on the broader scale of things, it could actually result in the workplace climate as a whole being quite different. So it's important to sort of address these things as you go. Again, as a reminder, everybody is human and makes mistakes, but if you are able to own up to them along the way, you can pretty much stop potential conflict in its tracks and repair relationships as you go. So again, imagining yourself on the other side. If a colleague said something that they didn't mean to you and then went away, thought about it, came back and apologized, imagine how you would feel versus if they said something and then just ignored it and kept going. It's going to be quite a different outcome. So that's the 5 points for today. So I'm going to summarize them briefly, but of course this video will be uploaded to our Facebook page, so feel free to go through it as many times as you need to, and also to ask any questions that you have if you do have them. So the first tip, recognizing that your perceptions may be different to reality. So when you're feeling negative emotions, you're more likely to have negative thoughts and assume that these thoughts are facts. So make sure that you're really asking yourself, what's the evidence for this? Or is there a different way of looking at this? Secondly, being mindful of your styles of communication and aiming for assertiveness. So passivity is not helpful. It serves the other person's needs but not yours. Aggressiveness, also not helpful. It serves your needs but not the other person's. And finally, passive aggression serves neither your needs or the needs of the other person. So these three styles of communication, we're all going to do them at some point, because we're human and we make mistakes, but it is important to reflect on the way in which you're communicating and aim for assertiveness, which is where you are acknowledging your own needs as well as the needs of your colleague. Thirdly, listening. Again, something that's spoken about often but is really hard to do when you are feeling overly stressed, anxious, angry, whatever the strong emotion is. So really taking the time to listen to your colleagues so that they feel heard and validated in exactly the same way as you would want to be. Next, recognizing your own and your colleagues' successes. So if we're always focused on the negative or the things that aren't going so well, that's really going to impact our mood, and it's going to impact the way in which we behave as well. And sometimes that can involve communication. So that's more likely to lead to conflict. Whereas if we are really taking a balanced view of what we have done, and we've reflected on the things that we've done well as well, and the things that our colleagues have done well, it gives us a much better perspective, and conflict will be less likely. Finally, correcting and apologising if you are in the wrong. So again, I cannot overemphasise, we are all human and we all make mistakes. So if you have said the wrong thing, don't just brush it off, don't just avoid it, because that's just going to cause more turmoil in the long run and potentially could really impact the culture of your organisation. Just own up to it as you go, reflect, continually reflect, and this will reduce the likelihood of conflict and improve the quality of your relationships in the workplace. So hopefully that has been helpful to everybody today. Like I said, please feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. I will work out what the topic is for next week, but if anybody has any suggestions, please also feel free to reach out and ask. Otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you next Tuesday. Take care. Bye.